of the best things about being a retro gamer is having the unique perspective on gaming that we do, and a big part of that is having experienced gaming years ago. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, gaming was a different kind of animal. This video is not necessarily an argument for why it was or wasn't better, but more about the characteristics and quirks of gaming from that time period, let's say the mid-80s through the 90s. That being said, there will inevitably be some shots taken at modern gaming, though I'll try not to be too obnoxious about it, like, you know what only retro gamers understand? When games were actually fun. A lot of the quirks of retro gaming are merely a result of the technology at the time. For example, the rumor mill when it came to games back then was in full crank. Kids were spreading all sorts of false information about games around the playgrounds. And why did they do it? Because it was hard to call kids out on their bull shenanigans. Nowadays you can just quickly check the internet to see if something is real or not. But back then there was a lot more mystery around games. If you wanted to say that there was a secret way to unlock Luigi as the first opponent in Punch-Out, you could say that. If you wanted to say there was a secret way to play as Vanilla Ice in Mortal Kombat, you could say that. If you wanted to say there was a secret way to use the fireball from Street Fighter and Mega Man X, oh shoot, that one was real? Yeah, the thing is that there actually were some cool secrets put into games. As a result, secrets were a much bigger deal, whether true or not, and a huge part of the appeal was trying to figure out which ones were real. Even now that I'm older, I still find it fun to go back and see which secrets I missed. For example, maybe I was a dumb kid, but I never knew you could turn into Super Sonic in Sonic 2. But you actually can. That seems like something that would be made up. Of course, when it comes to secrets, cheat codes are a big part of it too. There were dedicated devices like Game Genie and Game Shark, but then there were the cheat codes that were hard-coded into the game and you just needed to know how to activate them. Of course, the most famous code of all was up, 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 down, 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 left, right to activate cheater mode in Mr. Nuts. Heck yeah, that was a good one. Okay, fine, it was the Konami code in Contra that gave you 30 lives, and boy is it a sign of a true retro gamer if you know this one by heart. Contra was a difficult game and lots of people needed the code just to make it to the end. I always thought 30 lives was a bit overkill, and apparently so did Konami, as they changed it to just 10 for the sequel, Super C. Passwords were also very relevant to retro games as a makeshift form of saving your game. When you reach certain points in the game, it will give you a password to write down that will allow you to resume where you left off the next time you play. Typically, entering a password isn't so bad, but there are certain games that act like their passwords are protecting top secret military information. I mean, what's at stake here? Is it really so bad if somebody advances to a certain level in the game without having played up to it before? Then of course there are the games that don't have a password feature, or save battery for that matter. So what are we supposed to do here? Play the whole game in a single sitting? Well, I guess you could, but this is where most of us had a little trick up our sleeves that I like to call leaving the console on for hours and perhaps even days at a time. Remember now, cartridge-based consoles were silent, and even early disc-based consoles were pretty quiet too. So they'd be inconspicuous if you left them on, as opposed to some of the more modern consoles that can sound like a jet engine taking off once the system is left on long enough, gets hot, and those fans start blasting away. However, that doesn't mean it wasn't impossible for your console to be turned off while you were away. Oh no. Maybe your parents noticed that little red light still on and think you forgot to turn it off. Game over. Rookie mistake. Now, you can leave a note, but I always had the best luck just covering up the red light. The next thing I want to talk about is game magazines. Game magazines were essentially the replacement for what most people go to the internet for nowadays. There was no greater joy than having a magazine delivered to your house and diving into it to see what new gaming stuff you could find out. And perhaps even more likely, rifling through a magazine at a store or shop, then putting it back without ever having to pay for it. And when it comes to getting valuable information printed on paper, we got manuals too. too. Manuals get credit back then not only for existing, but also for being pretty dang useful, at least compared to later manuals, which just got sadder and sadder before disappearing altogether. Games weren't as big on holding your hand to show you how to play the game back then, and manuals served more of a purpose, sometimes being crucial for knowing what to do, or at least getting worthwhile information about the game. And while we're talking about hand-holding, retro games didn't do a lot of that in general, leading to most retro gamers having more of a tolerance for getting their butts whooped by a game initially, and having the patience and resolve to get better at it. Yeah, I said I'd try not to take cheap shots at modern games, but here we are. Though, to be fair, some retro gamers don't have the same patience in their older age nowadays due to less available free time. Either way, beating a game was more of an accomplishment back then. Minigames were tough to beat, and it wasn't uncommon for some of our games to remain unbeaten. Not because the game dragged on too long and/or we got bored of it, no, it's because it was a legitimate challenge. More modern games basically make sure you can make it to the end one way or another. I've said this before, but beating most retro games means you're good at the game, whereas beating most modern games means you were able to dedicate enough time to play it. Next up, we've got blowing on cartridges, even though I've talked before about it being the wrong thing to do. The cartridge being slightly repositioned when you plugged it back in is what was actually getting it to work, not blowing your hot breath to add moisture to the pins and potentially cause corrosion. But still, there's no denying that this was a widespread thing that everybody would do, often resulting in a sort of a competition amongst friends for who could blow their nasty Capri Sun Cheeto breath into the cartridge the hardest. If a game didn't work, to us that meant it needed to be blown on. If that still didn't get it to work, then that meant it needed to be blown on even harder. Another thing that only retro gamers will understand is just how precious of a commodity these were. You put these suckers into various machines and good things happened. And perhaps the best kinds of machines were arcade games. Super popular in the 80s, they weren't as popular in the 90s, though still enough that both 80s and 90s kids have fond memories. The arcades were a place you'd go to play games that had the most cutting edge technology, and look out for that one creepy older dude who looks right at home in a dark environment. And even though consoles would eventually catch up to arcades, it was still a place where a lot of games would make their debut, meaning you could find new games here. It was exciting stuff. Going to the arcade meant possibly finding a new awesome game, or at the very least playing an old favorite, not trying to win a ridiculous amount of tickets only to cash it in for a cheap yo-yo and 27 Tootsie Rolls. Arcades were also one of the more common ways that competitive multiplayer would happen as well. Think you're good at Street Fighter 2, huh? Well, there's a kid at the arcade who knows how to spam Ken's Hadouken fireballs even better than you do, so ha! And speaking of multiplayer, the differences don't stop in the arcade either. Retro gamers experienced what is often called local couch multiplayer, a lost art form if you ask me, where the people you'd be playing against were all in the same room, and in a shocking twist, these were people you actually knew. I know, we were radicals back then. This typically resulted in some multiplayer matches full of screaming, shouting, and most importantly, fun. Of course, some games would use split screen, which allowed for what we like to call screen peeking, but come on people, there are ways to fight back against screen peeking. Oh, and if you were playing at somebody else's house, almost guaranteed you would get the crappy third-party controller. If it had something like Mad Catz written on it, then it might as well have had your name written on it too. There's a lot of smaller things unique to retro gaming as well, like elevator stages. Games love to have those elevator stages, and especially beat 'em ups. A nice little convenient way to have the stage scroll up and down instead of side to side while simultaneously throwing waves of enemies at you. There really is an endless amount of things that made video games different than they are now, but I think the biggest thing for me was just how quickly video games evolved back then. With diminishing returns, video games don't really change very quickly anymore. But back then, just think, we went from the NES to the Dreamcast all in the 90s. Pretty drastic difference. This kept gamers more on their toes. There was always something interesting and always something pushing the industry forward. which ironically pushed it to where it is now. If only we could have stayed there a little bit longer, which is kind of the idea behind being a retro gamer, honestly. That period of video games is just too good to let go of, and so we don't. And if you're like me, you don't plan on ever letting go of it. But that about does it for my thoughts. Of course, I really want to hear what examples you all have to list for things only retro gamers would understand, or perhaps something I mentioned that you really identify with. Like I said before, the list really is endless of all the different examples. So with that, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird.